Okay. You got me juicing?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again for History's Three Sides. Our next episode is today, episode 5, where we'll be talking about the first part of special education, or the history of special education. Joining us today is one of my former co-workers, Chris Boylan. He is a special education teacher, along with my co-host Ben, who is also a special education teacher. This is not my forte, so I don't know a whole lot about it. I know what I need to know as a general education teacher, but these guys are definitely the gurus. So what we're going to do today is they are going to discuss some of the history of special education up to a couple of the legislative decisions that have been made. And I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to ask some of the questions that parents of students that would be general education students would be asking concerning their students' rights when it comes to having a student in the classroom that is a student that is special education and has what to a lot of you might not know what they are, individualized education plans, or IEPs, that we deal with when we have students that are special education students. Gentlemen.
So, I think as we start this, I think a good place to start is kind of give people some historical perspective of a little bit how we've gotten to where we are with special education. Because I think when you're talking this stuff, it's important to understand what it came out of and where it came from. And a predominant amount of this came about from 3 different groups. The people with visual impairments, people with hearing impairments, and then mental health are really the areas that really drove a lot of, I think, what we see today. I mean, would you agree with that, Ben?
Oh, absolutely.
That's kind of where
it all started with being different, being enough to make you separate.
Yeah. I mean, you look in this country, we didn't really have the first, I guess what we would call now special education services. I mean, it was 1817 before we had our first school that really focused on the needs of any population. It was a school for the deaf in Connecticut. So we're really, if you think about it in terms of world history, we're only talking about 200 years of history. But I think what's fascinating is within that 200 years, it's really only been about the last 50 years that we've seen major things happening when it comes as far as school and disabilities kind of thing.
And only in the past 30 years have we really seen legislation to drive that. So that's key too when you think about that 200-year gap.
Yeah.
170 years that were addressing people with disabilities, you were just kind of the village idiot. There's the reason that term came about. People didn't want, okay, that guy's he's just an idiot. He's, he has problems. He was an idiot, or he was a moron or a retard. These were actual terms used to define people with disabilities back then, and they were commonplace and acceptable.
Yeah.
Something historically that now, if you look at it, is as much as it's thrown around, these terms aren't terms we freely use to describe people with problems, just because it's become a modicum of cruelty, in all honesty.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too when you look back at the history of this, what was even going on in culture that drove a lot of it. And I think when you look back, you got to look at, in the late 19th century, the whole eugenics movement.
Right.
And what the eugenics movement did in terms of resulting in laws that prevented people with disabilities from moving into this country. You could be turned away for a disability. They passed laws that limited who you could marry, as far as having children, which led to, and if anybody in Indiana is familiar with, which led to the creation of things like Central State, Muscatatuck, Madison, Logansport, those places where we saw mass institutionalizations of people with disabilities.
There's also something that they don't talk about much is there was forced sterilization. Due to
Yes.
disability, you weren't allowed to be able to even have the prospect of breeding. So they would sterilize you, and many through chemical and sometimes surgical means.
Well, and remember, in 1927, the Supreme Court actually backed this.
Yeah,
Buck versus Bell, the Supreme Court actually backed that forced sterilization of people with disabilities was legal in the United States.
It was a way to relieve the burden from public. What was it?
Yeah.
Relieve the burden of public. Oh, I can't remember. I remember reading the final thing. It was basically decreasing the surplus population.
Yeah. And then, you look at it, and I think what's interesting is when you got to look at the things in history that happened that kind of push. My grandfather used to always have a saying that I might not be able to change things, but I can ding it enough to make things change their course.
Right.
And when you fast forward to the League of the Physically Handicapped during the 1930s, when they were doing their sit-ins, which was all driven by, makes you wonder, had we not had FDR elected president, would those groups have had the courage to say, look, we have a president in a wheelchair. Okay, now it's time for us to get our rights. Now it's time for us to get employment, to end some of this government discrimination and things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think a lot of people realize either FDR was handicapped in polio as a child.
There's a reason he's on the dime. I mean, people kind of, it's one of those things I think in history people forget about. He was very big behind the March of Dimes.
He could barely move without crutches.
Oh.
His wife Eleanor did so much more as the first lady than he ever did as president. He was acting president in his stead while he was bedridden for long periods of time, unable to walk, unable to move.
I don't think his son gets enough credit either.
What's that?
I don't think his son gets enough credit with all that either.
I'd like to point something out, guys. I'd like to point something out too, though, that even though Roosevelt was as popular as he was, he still, and this goes along with the special education, he still fought hard to keep people from knowing that he had a disability.
Everything he did was covered up. A lot of people didn't know until he had passed in office and he was, replaced. He had disabilities he did because it was a very big secret, even with his own cabinet, that it is not a public thing that he was in a wheelchair. That's why he had a blanket over his lap when he was sitting. It was to cover the fact he was in a wheelchair, not in a regular chair, or to when he moved from chair to wheelchair, so that people couldn't tell his legs were shriveled and not, as functional as possible. Look at the picture of him with Stalin and Churchill. He's the only one. He's got his legs covered, just to cover up because it wasn't acceptable. He did a very good job of hiding it. He might not have made president if had people known the extent of his disabilities.
It's I always thought, it's kind of a little side on it, I always found it very fascinating with all the time, as awkward and as painful as it was for him to move. It would have been very easy for the press at the time to get a compromising picture or to get that unflattering picture or to write an article even about it. And if you look back in the historical record, and I think it just goes to show how far we've digressed in politics in this country.
Honestly, the press used to have scruples.
They didn't go after him on it.
No, the press used to have a scruples. They weren't out there to smear people and just destroy them just because they could. So, different world for sure.
So, but then, so back when we start looking at the history as you go forward, again, how little things in history nudge change. Roosevelt did, of course, March of Dimes and was very adamant advocate for physical. Truman was also one I don't think that gets historically enough credit. He actually back in the, was it 19, I think it was 45-ish range, created the National Employee Handicapped Week, I think is what he called it at the time. Yeah. But he had a concerted effort to say, look, yes, it's okay to employ. Now, mind you, it was driven by the vets coming back from World War II that had become physically disabled. But still, to have a president step up and be that kind of vocal and advocate is still a pretty big.
It's a big deal, especially at a time when that was unheard of.
Yeah.
Because there were no programs for the VA at the time. People came back from World War II that were shattered, damaged, broken. Yeah, you found ways to have public works put in place so they could be productive members of society.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from grassroots movements, like you said. I'll tell you locally here, and I know a lot of people personally. Still, when I worked at Opportunity Enterprises for a number of years before I got into teaching, and that was a place for adults that we would be in IEP classes, severe and profound, basically. And local families here in Valpo, they rented out a church basement, and they had a school for the retarded. And these families, many of them still here today. One of the leading principal or people who helped build this was actually my middle school principal, and they created this school with his younger sister and other local disabled members of the community, and they started this school privately in the basement, which later transformed into OE, because they weren't allowed to integrate. So they had to be separate. But unless you were personally involved in the lives of somebody who had a disability, it didn't matter to you. So the grassroots pushed that movement to the point where now there's a huge corporation here in Valpo that caters specifically to the needs of people with disabilities.
And I think not even just for people with disabilities, but throughout history, one of the common threads that you can kind of pull out on a lot of things is that grassroots nature of it.
Right.
It is the families that usually, like in special education, if it wasn't for families, pushing for change, a lot of what we saw happen wouldn't have happened. I mean,
Right.
Fast forward, we've gotten up through Truman in the 40s, but the first president that we really had that created a commission and really went at this was Kennedy.
Right.
And a lot of people forget or just don't know the Kennedy family's connection to the special needs community.
No, they did actually have a very deep, and they had several members of their family that were
Rosalind.
exactly.
Yeah.
And again, it comes from their empathy guides or has guided the creation of the support and advocacy that they have.
They created Special Olympics.
Exactly. Right? It's huge now. Special Olympics is massive.
Yeah. But to have a president who had that family connection, and I think that was 1961 when he did that.
Yeah, 61 or 62.
Yeah. And so I mean, there again, we're only talking the last 60 years of history,
right,
when you really started, I think, getting the attention on this stuff. And I think something, before we jump too far ahead here, the other piece of this that I think it's important to mention is how vital Brown versus Board of Education ended up being when we talk any of the other Supreme Court cases moving forward. It all goes back to Brown versus Board.
I wonder if I was wondering if that was going to come up separate but equal.
Yeah, it became a civil rights issue at that point. These people have a right to attend school just like everybody else does. And again, separate but equal.
Yeah. And we actually lucked out a little bit. And sometimes history is about right people, right place, kind of lucky.
Oh, yeah.
And the Supreme Court we had during that time period, we actually kind of were fortunate that they were very...
they were forward thinking.
They were very proactive, socially thinking on this stuff. Right. And I think from there, when you start looking at it, you start just seeing kind of a rapid succession of things over the next 10 years of stuff start to happen, which all came down to what I think it was late 60s is when you get the Park versus Pennsylvania decision.
Right.
and Park was Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children. Tell us how far we've come with the way we name things.
And that was perfectly acceptable. Perfectly
Well,
acceptable. It was a
that's,
legitimate title.
we can get into a whole other discussion of words that were socially acceptable that you look at now, you're like, ooh.
Yeah. Ooh, keep it down the doorway.
If you ever question that, go ask an old military guy what they called a cigarette, and then we'll come
Yeah.
back and have the discussion.
That's my British brother-in-law, what they call him. Yeah.
Well, we used to have classroom aides too. So,
Right.
but when you look at what Park versus Pennsylvania did, it took disability and special needs rights. At that time, it was just developmental disabilities.
Correct.
And I think when you look at this, and you look at the history, it's not like one decision was a broad swipe and addressed everybody.
Not even close.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it definitely took piecemeals, you know, as we go on, you know, with ELL, you had Nichols versus San Francisco, you had Mills v. District of Columbia. But what Park did was it was a group that said, hey, look, just because our children have a developmental disability does not mean that they give up their rights to an education. Whatever that education looks like, that we have a right, we pay our taxes, they're citizens, we have a right for this. Luckily, the Supreme Court agreed with them. Well, that covered developmental disabilities. It wasn't until Mills v. Washington, D.C. district that now we're including kids with mental health disabilities. I think it also included emotional,
Intellectual,
and one other cognitive.
yeah.
It started including more of that stuff, which is great. Now schools are required to take the kids. Wonderful. Any of us in education know, okay, great. Where's the money and how is this going to happen?
Right.
So, you know, we kind of fell into this almost 10-year period until the feds finally acted and created the Rehabilitation Act of 1971. But I think it's also when you look at the cases, I'm looking at my cheat notes, I'll be completely honest. One of the other things I think that it's important to look at is when the Mills decision came out. At the time, I don't think people really grasped what it was doing. But Mills is the piece of is the ruling that we can thank for IEPs.
Right.
The judges said, yes, you need to educate all of the kids, but you also need to show us a plan of how is their education going to be geared to them and be done differently.
And what supports they have to be successful.
Which I've been around this enough years and old enough that I remember the old island days, as I call them, where you had special education teachers on this side. These are my kids. Here's the gen ed. We want to be involved, but we want created we want a separate but equal kind of environment.
There is still some of that. There really is still some of that. And I've experienced it. And it's now I see more, though. I see it more on the gen ed side than I do the special ed side, where the gen ed, I actually had a gen ed teacher tell me, I want to teach special education. I would have gone to school for that. It's like, well, that's not an option though anymore.
No.
And that's where we also have the co-teaching model and paraprofessionals to go into the classrooms to provide aid or pull out to provide aid, or do have, in some cases, separate classrooms where they are able to come and get the differentiation they need for their classwork.
And I think this is where next week when we get back on here, we really get into that discussion.
Right.
Because I always have held the position, and this might be heresy as an educator, I think within special education, when you look at how we truly wanted separate rights when this all first started, because nobody really knew.
Well, just any rights at that point.
Yeah, but I think we were sometimes our own worst enemy with this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
I think when you look at some of the current legislation that has recently gone through, we're starting to finally correct some of those errors.
Right.
But there's no doubt, No Child Left Behind was one of the most famous.
It was more of a one, I think, for special treatment. Without, I hate to say it, but initially I think it was like not only did they want to be included, there was a need for special treatment on top of that, and that's going to cause animosity, obviously, between
Absolutely.
the two sectors. And yeah, as a special educator, and you all know, you get protective of your students.
Yeah.
I mean, we do, and by nature, even as gen ed teachers do. I think maybe, especially just because we know that they're already fighting with 1 foot in the bucket, you know. So I think you're right, though. I think there's a point where you can ask for too much almost, to the detriment of. It's one of those,
not be one held accountable.
It's gonna be one of those things that you're gonna get everything you want. Do you want everything you're gonna get? You know, that's.
And we can get into this when we start talking No Child Left Behind, because I think it's a lot of those attitudes in special education that put us behind the 8 ball when No Child Left Behind came out.
No Child Left Behind.
Well, but that's when the feds said, hey, look, if you guys aren't going to take accountability and fix these issues that we keep pointing out, No Child Left Behind was simply a response to educators not listening to warnings. The feds warned us about No Child Left Behind for years.
Right.
And education didn't listen.
We're running a little bit short on time here. We're going to have to cut this close. I know you guys talk about it, special education all day long, which I could listen to it all day long. But we're getting short on time here. So what I'd like to make sure everybody knows is you can go check out our History's Three Sides Facebook page. You can join us there if you want to become a member of our group. Absolutely, just send us a request for an invitation. We'll send that out. Answer 3 short questions why you're interested in history, and we'll get you part of that group. Also, we are still looking for somebody to design a logo for us for our History's Three Sides. So if you know anybody that's got some artistic talent and would like to work not necessarily on commission, but get some free advertisement and free merchandise when we do start producing merchandise, send them our way. We're looking for somebody to do that for us. So next week, what we're going to be talking about is some of the stuff with special education, some of the legislation like Americans Disability Act, the Individuals Disabilities for Education Act, and like Chris has pointed out, No Child Left Behind. So that's some of the legislation that has come down the pipeline to help our students that do have disabilities. And I don't know if you all noticed today when we're talking about the students with disabilities, we don't say blind children or deaf children. We put the person first as to avoid some of the labels that has come out because of disabilities. It's people first language that you will notice that we have used. We definitely use a child that has autism or a child that is blind. We don't put the label in front of the child. We put the child first. Right. So that's something that
they are not
make sure that you understand. Yep, we want to make sure you understand. But again, next week, Chris will be joining us again as our special guest, talking about special education. Ben, our special education guru between the two hosts. And we appreciate everybody joining us here today. Anybody have any questions before we go?
Nope. Sounds good.
All right.
Next week.
Again,
next week we get into fun case law and legal stuff, which I'm a Supreme Court geek, so I will fully.
The difference between a 50, between an IEP and a
504.
Yeah, 504 and FAPE and all that good stuff. So.
I'm also talking about how lawyers have completely muddled the waters on everything.
Yes. Thank you for joining us again this week, Chris. Thank you, Ben, for coming back with us.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will post on our Facebook page for those that are interested some documentaries that you might want to check out about some of the asylums that our people that had disabilities had to face and some of the challenges that they've overcome in some of these documentaries. So I look forward to those.
I would also highly recommend reading anything written by Temple Grandin.
Okay.
On
the website.
Her insight into having being an adult who lives with autism and has a doctorate in animal husbandry. She's one of the first
Multi-millionaire
people
now.
in the community that was able to communicate her experiences.
She's funny. She's funny too. She's hilarious.
Oh yeah, her book Thinking in Pictures, I think should be required reading for anybody going in education.
And look her up on YouTube. You can watch an entire document, 45 minutes of her speaking, and it is mind-blowing how self-aware she is, funny she is about it,
Oh yeah.
completely unaware that she dealt with autism her entire life. It's
Okay,
phenomenal.
so guys, make sure that you check out our Facebook page. We'll have this information on there. Ben and I and Chris will post information about documentaries and books and different people that you might want to check out when it comes to learning a little bit more about special education. So again, guys, thank you, and we will see y'all again next week.
All right, later, gents.